I'm delighted to be able to introduce Daniel Philpott, Ph.D. from Harvard, who is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He's an active scholar of religion and global politics who is specialized in reconciliation, religious freedom, political theology, and theories of political behavior of religious people. Among his several books are Just and Unjust Peace, An Ethic of Political Reconciliation, which was published in 2012, and a forthcoming book, Religious Freedom in Islam, The Fate of a Universal Human Right in the Muslim World Today. And this is going to appear...
March.
Okay. Imminently. Okay. He's published articles with the Journal of Religious Ethics, Journal of Law and Religion, Ethics and International Affairs, the Annual Review of Political Science, American Political Science Review, Journal of International Affairs, and a number of others. And especially, and why we were so glad that he accepted our invitation to come, Dr. Philpott is co-director of the Under Caesar's Sword project, which, as I think we'll hear more about, examines Christian responses to persecution. And this has been funded by Templeton, so no small thing. So Professor Philpott, we're really glad that you're here. Welcome to Baylor. Delighted you came.
Thank you, Dan. Yes. Thank you all for having me and for coming. I want to thank in particular Byron Johnston and the Institute for Studies of Religion for the invitation, Dan Williams, Francis Malone, Leon Miller for organizing it, providing such great hospitality. And also want to acknowledge Chris Van Gorder, who's one of the Under Caesar's Sword scholars, which I'll be explaining in a moment, studies Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if that's not heroic enough, he's recently had quadruplets in his family. So and all the more reason I'm grateful that he could be here. So very good. On March 2nd, 2011, Muslim militants gunned down Shahbaz Bhatti, Pakistan's federal minister for minorities affairs, just outside his home in Islamabad. A Roman Catholic, Bhatti had accepted his government post out of a calling to protect Pakistan's oppressed, downtrodden, and marginalized, as he said, in particular its religious minorities, Christians, Ahmadi Muslims, Shia Muslims, and others. Aware that his calling had placed his life in danger, Bhatti had renounced marriage so as not to leave behind fatherless children. Not long before he was assassinated, he recorded a video in which he stated, "I believe in Jesus Christ who has given his own life for us and am ready to die for a cause. I'm living for my community and I will die to defend their rights." Bhatti's story is inspiring and jarring, but in many respects unremarkable. It could be told as a tale of Islamist violence or of the global curtailment of religious freedom, themes that have received much attention and controversy in recent years. Somewhat more freshly and provocatively, the story could be situated in the context of the global persecution of Christians, a community that faces a disproportionate share of religious freedom violations and whose plight has been underreported in the mainstream media and by human rights organizations. Even this story, though, is being told more and more. Several writers have chronicled it, prominent media outlets have run stories on it, and the U.S. State Department came to recognize it when it declared Christians, along with other religious minorities, victims of genocide in Syria and Iraq in March 2016. What is both remarkable and has not been remarked upon often enough is Bhatti's response to an environment of persecution and how Christians around the world respond to persecution. This is the subject of the project Under Caesar's Sword, which I'm here to tell you about. Persecuted Christians are not inert, passive victims. Bhatti's life alone involves several active and deliberate responses to persecution. The project explores the creativity and deliberation with which many persecuted Christian communities engage and respond to the repression they face. Creativity and deliberation, along with courage, that Bhatti's own short life epitomizes. Having dedicated his life to religious freedom, for example, Bhatti advanced legislation to reform Pakistan's draconian blasphemy laws and further the cause of religious minorities, built coalitions among religious communities, and advocated the forgiveness of his enemies. After Bhatti's murder, his brother, Paul Bhatti, displayed further the drama of Christian response to persecution. As he described in his speech at a conference held by the Under Caesar Sword Project in Rome in December 2015, earlier in his life, he had fled Pakistan in the wake of attacks on Christians and had taken up practice as a surgeon in Italy, despite his brother Shabaz's appeals to stay with his people in Pakistan. When Shabaz was killed, Paul flew back to Pakistan to attend his brother's funeral, intending thereafter to leave Pakistan forever. Astounded by the outpouring of tributes to his brother's life, including from Muslims, Paul came to see more clearly the meaning of Shabaz's love and witness. He was moved to stay in Pakistan, where he accepted an invitation to take up his brother's minister's seat, as well as the chairmanship of the All Pakistan Minorities Alliance, which his brother had founded. Then, through his mother's example, Paul came to forgive his brother's killers, concluding that forgiveness and love are the ultimate weapons of revenge. The Bhatti brothers' responses to the denial of their religious freedom are the kinds of responses to Christian persecution that the over 15 researchers commissioned by the Under Caesar Sword Project discovered in over 25 countries around the world. What these responses are, what the project in general is about, what we can learn from these responses, and how we can be in solidarity with persecuted Christians is what I'm here to speak with you about. In 2014, I and my colleagues at Georgetown's Religious Freedom Project, now the independent NGO, the Religious Freedom Institute, were inspired to ask how Christians respond to persecution. By then, a few analysts had documented the persecution of Christians. We wanted to know, what do they do when they are under this kind of pressure? We applied for and were awarded a grant of $1.1 million from the Templeton Religion Trust for a 3-year project. We formed a team of scholars, some of the leading scholars of global Christianity, sent them out into the field, and then put together a series of modes of dissemination to tell people about the results. All can be viewed on the project website, which I'll give you the URL for in a minute. The first major dissemination was a conference in Rome in December 2015, which Professor Phd attended, who's here, where the scholars first presented the results of what they found, along with many other speakers on the persecution of Christians. We've also got a documentary film, which can be viewed right from our website, produced by an award-winning documentary producer, Jason Cohen, on the West Coast. And this is a 26-minute documentary, can be shown to audiences. There's also a 7-minute version and a 1-minute, 30-minute trailer if you want to get a little taste of it. But it can all be viewed from our webpage and just played right from there. There's a public report that presents the findings of the scholars in an accessible, kind of visually appealing way. It was launched in Washington, D.C. in April 2017 at the National Press Club, and we translated it to 4 languages and sent it around the world. It also can be accessed in an interactive format, also on our website. The URL is there. We now have a volume of scholarly essays with essays by our Under Caesar Sword scholars. You can see Chris Van Gorder here, and in the flesh right here. And that just came out with Cambridge University Press, hot off the presses. Contains, this is the most kind of scholarly presentation of our work. All of the scholars who went around the world present chapters from what they found about Christian responses to persecution around the world, synthetic essay at the beginning. And there's only one small glitch, which is that it cost $140. So that's how valuable it is. Maybe not, but that's how much Cambridge priced it. The good news is that in the spring it will come out in paperback, so it will be at a much more affordable price and much more purchasable. But so this is kind of on the most scholarly end of our modes of presentation. There's also curricula, I should say, for schools and parishes and churches. If you want to, it's a 7-module unit, 7 modules that can be adapted and made into a unit of a course or whatever you might want it for. Excellent for classroom situations, going down to the high school level or on up to adult and more adult settings. The goal of this and generally of the modes of dissemination is to raise awareness and promote solidarity with persecuted Christians around the world. All of this, again, including the film, the curricula, the public report, everything, can be found at our website, which is ucs.nd.edu. Why do we look at Christians? Some questions have been raised by skeptics. Why do you focus on this one religion and not all? The first thing to say is that looking at the persecution of Christians is really a question of religious freedom. Religious freedom is an international human right that people from every religion rightly enjoy. And we very much support the religious freedom of every human being, no matter what their faith, and all of the initiatives and organizations that we're a part of also promote religious freedom for other faiths in many different ways. However, at a time of increased attacks on religious freedom around the world, Christians are the largest group that faces persecution. And we also believe that the persecution of Christians does not receive proportionate attention. Our colleagues at Georgetown did a 3-year study a few years ago where they looked at the number of stories done on this by major human rights groups compared to other things, and the number was almost minuscule. So we feel that there's a mission here to raise awareness of the persecution of Christians. For Christians, there's also a kind of solidarity with those in the household of faith. In Galatians 6:10 it said, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people," there's that all people element, "especially to those who belong to the family of believers." So there's a mission to promote the religious freedom of all, but also if one is a Christian, which the organizers of this are, a kind of special responsibility to those in the household of faith as well. We also believe that our lessons that we've learned about response to persecution could be adopted and used by people of all faiths as well. Despite persistent attention in the media on brutal forms of persecution in Muslim-majority countries such as Iran or totalitarian regimes such as China, the global persecution of Christians assumes an extremely wide variety of forms and levels and takes aim at an immense range of targets. The swords of many different kinds of Caesars, including Little Caesars with no formal political authority at all, not to be confused with the pizza chain there, hang over a wide diversity of Christian communities all over the world. These Caesars brandish very different kinds of swords with very different kinds of objectives, ranging from the annoyance and harassment of Christians to their outright extermination. The regimes in which persecution occurs are also highly diverse. They include authoritarian regimes and failed states, but also well-established democracies such as Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka, whose open and competitive electoral systems have sometimes incentivized groups to target Christian minorities in order to attract the political support of non-Christian majorities. Here are 5 contexts illustrating this diversity in which Christians are persecuted. One is Islamist countries, countries with a kind of strong traditional conservative form of Islam that is promoted through the state. Then there are regnant communist regimes like China, Vietnam, Laos. Then there are what might be called secular authoritarian regimes, which are really fashioned in a kind of, with an aspiration towards modernization, often strongly nationalistic, strongly aspiring to build a modern, economically advanced nation, and then under the conviction that the marginalization of religion is critical for doing so. So Turkey, over most of its history of the Republic of Turkey, Central Asian republics like those in the Stans, Kazakhstan, and so forth, fit the description. There are also religiously nationalist regimes where the country has declared itself a homeland of a particular religion and promotes it through the state in a very kind of assertive way. So in India, under Hindu nationalist governments, Sri Lanka and its Buddhist nationalism, we see the same dynamic in Burma with respect to the Rohingya Muslims and so forth. There's a kind of national religious identity that can often be very exclusive of those who don't belong to the religion. And then we also, in the project, look at Western countries influenced by secularism, where religious freedom has increasingly been under pressure. Pope Francis called this phenomenon polite persecution. Similarly, the sword of persecution comes in very different shapes and sizes. Sometimes the machinery of state power brings down the full weight of Caesar's sword in the form of direct and appalling violence. Police and security services, sometimes directed by bureaus of religious affairs, forcibly break up church services and Bible studies, and imprison and torture pastors, evangelists, and rank-and-file church members for engaging in ordinary religious activities. In some of the same contexts, but in others as well, the sword of persecution assumes subtler and less violent forms. It is striking how much state-sponsored persecution of Christians is conducted with legality, regularity, and bureaucratic propriety. On the other hand, much Christian persecution arises from non-state actors. Again, we like to call them little Caesars, like the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Islamist militias in Indonesia's Maluku Islands, or Buddhist militants in Sri Lanka. Persecution by such groups can take extremely violent forms. Also manifesting an immense variety are the reasons that motivate so many states and non-state Caesars to inflict so many different kinds of persecutions on Christians. Perhaps the most common and widespread reason for Christian persecution, both in its more severe and in its mild forms, is the characteristic Christian insistence on being different and independent from comprehensive political control or cultural hegemony. Today, too, the simple refusal on the part of many Christians in various contexts to fit in and buckle under, and their determination to construct their own autonomous spheres, goes a long way towards explaining Christian persecution in numerous contexts. According to the Hudson Institute's Paul Marshall, one of the Under Caesar's Sword scholars, because Christianity denies that the powers that be are the ultimate arbiter of human life in any given context, it tends to resist attempts to impose a single supreme authority in state, society, or culture. Other factors vary across a wide range, some pertaining to genuine aspects of Christian theology and conduct, and others involving politicized and largely manufactured perceptions of Christian communities and their intentions. In numerous contexts outside the West, governments and majority religious communities perceive the very existence of a Christian minority as a pro-Western Trojan horse. In terms of magnitude, direction, and geographic breadth, then, global persecution is grim. Christian persecution takes place across a geographic band of enormous length and breadth, more or less coextensive with what journalist Eliza Griswold has described as the world's 10th parallel of religious conflict, that stretches from Libya, moves southward to northern Nigeria, moves eastward to Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, expands north to Russia and south to Sri Lanka, and then proceeds eastward to China, Indonesia, and North Korea. Based on systematic demographic analysis, Todd Johnson estimates that some 500 million Christians, more than 20% of Christians on earth, live in countries where they are subject to severe persecution, with virtually all of them in this geographic band. By 2020, Johnson predicts, this figure will rise to 600 million, or nearly a quarter of the world's Christian population. However, while large numbers of Christians are persecuted, and while Christian persecution constitutes a large scale of global religious persecution, it is equally true that the vast majority of Christians in the world today do not live in contexts of systematic or severe anti-Christian persecution. The vast majority of Christians live in the regions of Western Europe, North America, and South America, in which there is relative religious freedom and a relative absence of severe religious persecution. In fact, about 80% of the world's Christians live in Western Europe, North America, and South America, and do not witness the harsh repression characteristic of much of the rest of the world. In contrast, according to the Pew Research Center, roughly 3/4 of the world's total population of 7.2 billion, about 74%, were living in countries with high or very high restrictions or hostilities in 2014. On the basis of these numbers and proportions, then, a much smaller share of the world's Christians lives in countries subject to severe persecution, about 20%, than the share of the world's people that lives in countries subject to such persecution, which is about 74%. The implication of all this numbers magic is clear. Western Christians have little direct experience of the intense religious repression. In fact, most of the world's Christians have little direct experience of the intense religious repression that increasingly engulfs their fellow Christians who inhabit the world's persecution-rich 10th parallel, as well as the sometimes even more horrific persecution that non-Christian communities such as Yazidis, Baha'is, and Ahmadis face in many parts of the world. This experiential gap helps to explain the West's attention deficit towards the massive global challenge of religious persecution in general and Christian persecution in particular. What were the findings of the project? I wish to share 8. First, one of the most important fruits of our research was a typology of the vast array of Christian responses to persecution our scholars observed and analyzed across the world. 3 broad categories of response emerged, arrayed on a continuum from reactive to proactive: survival strategies, association strategies, and confrontation strategies. They are arrayed here on a pie chart. These categories then form the basis of the next 3 findings. The second finding is that Christian communities most commonly adopt survival strategies. These constituted 43% of strategies recorded. In pursuing strategies of survival, Christians focus on preserving their lives and their most basic activities: worship, community life, education, and the like. One of the starkest and simplest of strategies of survival is simply to flee, either elsewhere within a state or outside a state's borders, as Christians often do in settings of war and rampant violence, such as contemporary Iraq, Syria, Libya, and northern Nigeria. While flight can help secure survival, it can also accelerate, if not guarantee, the demise of the Christian presence in the locations from which Christians migrate. As a pair of our scholars, Chad Bauman and James Ponaya, observe about anti-Christian riots in Orissa, India in 2007 and 2008, quote, "If one of the goals of those who perpetrate anti-Christian harassment and violence is to Hinduize local geographies, then it is clear that the riots worked spectacularly," unquote. Positively, on the other hand, flight often results in what might be called the scattering of Christian seed. In the book of Acts, it said that on the day of Stephen's murder, a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. In a dynamic that is perennial in Christian history, persecution has often yielded an unintended expansionist consequence, as Christians forced to flee persecution have come to exercise religious and political influence in the new lands to which they have fled. Some of the Christian communities that contributed to the cultural mosaics of Iraq and Syria in the 20th century found themselves in these lands only because they were forced to flee the Armenian genocide of 1915. Another set of responses is covert and subterranean. One of these, which has taken place under regimes such as those in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Central Asia, and China, is to undertake characteristic Christian activities such as worship, educating children, and care for members of the community in secret. A recent precedent is the Ukrainian Catholic Church that became a church of the catacombs under Soviet rule after World War II, but resurfaced in 1991 when Ukraine gained independence. As one of our scholars, political scientist Kathleen Collins observes, the increasing state persecution of Christians in Central Asia leads most of them to simply hide, as one informant told her, leaving them virtually invisible in the public sphere. In other cases, Christian communities will adopt creative forms of cultural and legal camouflage. Some pursue strategies of cultural adaptation, such as speaking in a language acceptable to the regime, showing patriotism outside the walls of the church, or even hiding their faith through deception or feigning conversion to a non-Christian religion. Or Christians adopt a strategy of obfuscation, which Bauman and Ponaya observed in Sri Lanka, whereby they mask the religious nature of some of their institutions by legally incorporating them as non-religious companies, trusts, or societies. Some Christian communities in Iran speak a different language outside their churches, as Chris documented, while Protestant churches in Russia regularly and loudly display their patriotism and support for Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin's quasi-Christian nationalism and defenses of Christian moral commitments. In other cases, Christian communities forge tactical alliances with a dominant religious community, accommodate the authority of the state, or develop patterns of active cooperation with regimes and groups that engage in persecution. The next finding is that association strategies are the second most common response. They are 38% of the total. Here, Christians reach beyond survival to focus on building relationships and networks with groups outside their immediate communities, other Christians, non-Christians, and international actors, to enhance resiliency and mount some broad-based, though relatively non-confrontational, resistance to persecution. While these strategies take place at every level of persecution, they are most common and most robust in semi-open environments that afford opportunities for political action and expression even while persecution takes place. Pakistan, India, Russia, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Kenya, and Indonesia are all examples. By contrast, strategies of association are far less common in violent or highly repressive environments like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Gaza, China, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. One of the central goals of Christian communities in undertaking strategies of association is to counteract isolation through forging ties with other Christian churches, other religions, political parties, activist NGOs, or allies outside the country, including the United Nations, human rights organizations, other governments, and members of their own church outside their borders. Isolating Christian communities, keeping them hidden, obscure, and unconnected with outsiders, is, after all, a common stratagem of persecuting regimes and militant groups. It is not accidental that North Korea, the country about whose Christians the rest of the world knows the least, and where we didn't send a researcher, is the one in which Christians are persecuted the most. Common strategies of this sort are the building of ties with other churches and other religions. As Robert Dowd, our Africa scholar, Sub-Saharan Africa scholar, relates, Catholic and Protestant Christian communities in northern Nigeria have responded to the colossal violence inflicted by Boko Haram by forming ecumenical partnerships as well as ties with mainstream Islamic leaders in hopes of isolating Boko Haram. Carrie Kazel and Katya Dunayeva's chapter shows how in Russia, small non-Russian Orthodox churches, Christian churches like Protestant or Catholic or what have you, found success in circumventing the government's denial of their freedom through administrative measures by forming an umbrella association that gave them power in numbers. Likewise, Robert Hefner argues in his piece on Indonesia that the most central strategy through which Christian churches have resisted Islamist violence and intolerance since the fall of Suharto in 1998 has been to strengthen their links with large Muslim movements like Nahdlatul Ulama or Muhammadiyah, who uphold Indonesia's pluralist vision, which there is called Pancasila. A common associational strategy is the provision of social services, alleviating social ills through hospitals, rehabilitation programs for addictions, orphanages, homeless shelters, and the like. Now, this may not at first seem like a strategy of response. Is it not simply the mission and message of the church? It is that. But in serving the poor, Christian communities also build ties outside their walls, perform a service that governments value, and accrue credibility, thus strengthening their freedom. Protestant churches in Russia, for instance, commonly conduct ministries to alcoholics, and in doing so, gain the favor of local governments. Perhaps the most surprising among Christian strategies of association is forgiveness. This, too, may not at first seem like a strategy aimed at building relationships or institutions. Is it not mainly a relinquishment of resentment and revenge? Forgiveness, though, can also be an invitation to conversion and reconciliation, and thus a form of building ties. Think of Paul Bhatti, whose forgiveness strengthened ties between Christians and Muslim communities in Pakistan. The fourth finding is that the least common responses are ones of confrontation. These strategies are the most proactive. Here, Christians openly oppose a persecuting regime or militant group. In the early centuries of Christianity, numerous Christian leaders and theologians responded to the sometimes aggressive Roman persecution of Christians in an interestingly confrontational manner. Christian apologists such as Justin Martyr, Athenagoras of Athens, Tertullian, and Lactantius lived during episodes of intense, though also sporadic, Christian persecution, while Lactantius lived through the most systematic and widespread episode, the virtually empire-wide persecution under the Emperor Diocletian. Precisely as a creative response to persecution, these apologists directly confronted Roman imperial authorities not only with elaborate rebuttals of popular calumnies of Christianity, but also with arguments designed to demonstrate the inhumanity and injustice of Rome's persecutory policies. Indeed, in a real sense, patristic writers, particularly Tertullian and Lactantius, invented and developed history's first systematic articulations of religious freedom as a universal human right, precisely as a direct and confrontational response to the almost continuous Christian experience of persecution in the Church's early centuries. For example, Tertullian coined the very phrase religious freedom, libertatis religionis, in his Apologia 197, and insists that religious freedom is a matter of natural right, or human right, humanae juris, in his Ad Scapulum of 212. Significantly, the North African theologian formally addressed both of these writings to the Roman authorities responsible for formulating and implementing policies of Christian persecution. Christians undertake these strategies with the aim of bringing injustice to light, spurring others to confront injustice, and above all, ending injustice and widening the enjoyment of religious freedom. Confrontation can be located at every level of repression, though its form varies with context. In democratic or semi-democratic systems, confrontation will take place through demonstrations, public criticism, the documenting of human rights abuses, and pursuing redress through the courts. Where repression is so heavy that it affords little open expression, or where armed conflict rages, confrontation may take the form of armed resistance or the acceptance of martyrdom. Most commonly, confrontation strategies involve criticism and exposure. Sometimes, Christians document human rights abuses in order to reveal them to parties who can advocate on their behalf, foreign governments, for instance. They might also pursue court cases where they believe they might receive favorable judgments. Christians also voice protests of regimes and societal groups through nonviolent demonstrations and public criticism in newspapers, television, and the internet. Again, the more open settings of India and Indonesia, as well as Nigeria and Kenya, afford opportunities for this exercise of voice. Confrontation becomes harsher and more dangerous when it takes the form of armed resistance. Christians in Iraq and Syria chose not to flee, but to take up arms against the Islamic State and other Muslim militants. In these and other cases, resistance was not against the regime, but rather against militant groups whom the regime had failed to suppress. Confrontation can also take the form of martyrdom and imprisonment, which can be seen as strategies and not merely fate, when Christians express or practice their faith or advocate for justice in full knowledge or expectation of such suffering. Martyrdom is arguably the most proactive of strategies, for it involves the least acquiescence to the repression of the state and is the greatest expression of Christian freedom, testifying that even death cannot suppress faith. Examples of martyrdom as responses to persecution can be found in the Chinese Catholic and Protestant leaders in China who accepted death or decades of life in prison as a consequence of refusing to accept the communist government's official church structures. While martyrdom is an authentic, perhaps even the quintessential Christian response to persecution, though, the Under Caesar Sword research finds that high-profile instances of it are rare. It is not rare, of course, for Christians to die for their faith. Thousands do every year. However, the Christian whose martyrdom gains wide attention within or outside a country or results in pressure against a persecuting government is uncommon. The fifth finding is that Christian responses to persecution are conspicuously nonviolent and, with very few exceptions, do not involve acts of terrorism. The research of our Under Caesar Sword scholars conveys the rarity of Christian communities taking up arms against their persecutors. Given that Christian communities are often tiny minorities, they might appear to be natural candidates for deploying an all too common weapon of the weak in recent years, terrorism. In fact, while some Christians have taken up violence, we found 6 cases, they have usually done so in self-defense and as a response to open violence by or among armed groups. Often, too, Christians who have engaged in violence live side by side and engage in dialogue and argument with other Christians who renounce violence. Part of what explains this paucity of violent retaliation against persecution is the important role that theology and religious doctrine play in structuring and limiting the menu of theologically and morally acceptable strategic options available to Christian leaders and communities. While Christians are capable of violence, even against innocents in certain instances, the predominant just war doctrine forbids violence in many contexts of persecution. Christian tradition and spirituality also offer doctrines and practices that help Christians imagine and enact alternative forms of response to violence, for instance, by restoring right relationships through forgiveness and reconciliation instead of continuing the violence. A sixth finding is that theology, in particular a Christian community's theology of suffering, church, and culture, influences the response of that community. Many factors help explain Christians' responses to persecution: the level and kind of persecution, the size of the Christian community in proportion to the surrounding population, the cohesiveness and centralization of the community, the history of the community in the region, and the kind of leadership present in the community. But as we have already noted in the previous finding on the prevalence of nonviolence, another important factor is the community's theological commitments with regard to evangelization, interfaith dialogue, the use of force, the purpose of the state, the meaning of culture, and the role of persecution in the Christian life and in salvation history. Some Christian communities see persecution as God's will, a trial to be endured in fulfillment of Scripture, perhaps as a precursor to the end time or the final realization of God's kingdom on earth, when Christ will defeat evil directly and deliver his persecuted followers. Others may interpret persecution not as God's will, but as an evil to be opposed and defeated by all justifiable means, even if it is also to be expected. As mentioned in our fifth finding, Christian communities also draw on doctrines of what methods of response are justified, some favoring nonviolence, others being more favorable to the use of force. Christians also differ fairly significantly over the value of interreligious dialogue and over the meaning and worth of the standard linguistic, cultural, and social norms in their countries. A seventh finding is that evangelical and Pentecostal Christians are more likely to be persecuted than mainline Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, or other Christians associated with ancient churches. And in response to persecution, evangelical and Pentecostal Christians are more likely to engage in strategies of survival and confrontation and less likely to engage in strategies of association. Several factors explain this broad finding. In many countries, evangelicals and Pentecostals are comparatively recent arrivals, having experienced very sudden and significant growth in many contexts in the global South only in the last 50 to 100 years, or even fewer, and thus have not established patterns of relating to surrounding populations and governments to the same degree as Christians with decades and even centuries of history in a given region. In addition, evangelicals and Pentecostals are often perceived to be directly and generously supported by co-religionists and allies in the West, with significant infusions of funds and missionary support. Next, evangelicals and Protestants are strongly committed to evangelization and conversion, and consequently expect and are prepared to endure persecution. Then, too, the conversion efforts of evangelicals and Pentecostals have sometimes mobilized and empowered relatively marginalized groups, such as women and Dalits or untouchables in India, in ways that have disrupted the social status quo and challenged dominant culture and political hierarchies. The powers that be often respond by persecuting both the evangelicals and Pentecostals believed to be responsible for the conversionary efforts, as well as the converts to the new faith. I do emphasize, though, that these are broad patterns, not exact correlations. Christians of other churches also evangelize, sometimes to a costly degree. Likewise, evangelicals and Pentecostals sometimes seek cooperative relationships with governments and so forth. And a wide variety of churches advocate for justice and provide social services. Do Christian responses to persecution succeed? Under what conditions do they succeed? Our eighth finding is that while success is difficult to define, some strategies of response have produced tangible results worthy of emulation. The question of success is not an easy one to answer because it is not immediately clear what a successful response is. It might seem that success is alleviating persecution and increasing religious freedom. According to this measure, few of the responses that our researches document would count as successes, at least in the short-term span of time in which we observe them. None of the chapters describes anything like the historic role of Pope John Paul II in achieving the collapse of a communist government in Poland during the 1980s, for instance. Success might be measured in other ways, though. It could mean that a repression was stopped or mitigated in some way. By a less exacting standard, it could mean just that a given response to persecution was carried out. Refugees fled, ties between churches or religions were established, an injunction with the court was filed. Even these straightforward matters can involve difficult matters of interpretation, though. Take martyrdom, for instance. Is it a success? On the surface, it looks an awful lot like a defeat for religious freedom. In countries like China and Iran, however, martyrdom has inspired the growth of churches, confirming the famous quip of the early Christian Tertullian, "The blood of martyrs is seed of the church." From a theological standpoint, martyrdom is also a success on a more ultimate scale. In our scholars' findings, success is most straightforwardly evidenced, without requiring ambitious interpretation, where a response is clearly connected with a positive result, such as a lessening of violence or a salutary reform of government policy. To cite just one example, one of our scholars, Reg Reimer, discusses the example of Laotian pastor Reverend Kamphone Pontupanya, who as General Secretary of the Lao Evangelical Church, negotiated and advocated with the government for greater religious freedom for that church and sometimes achieved improved protection. Previously, he had spent years in a prison and re-education camp where he was known for befriending his jailers. So that's an example of a kind of concretely identifiable success. And these kinds of concrete successes can be found throughout the many chapters elicited by the findings of our scholars. Is there any general finding that arises from the research or any thematic skein running through the chapters of the book and the project's findings? I venture to generalize that Christian responses to persecution are dominated by a creative pragmatism characterized by practical measures aimed at achieving short-term success in securing the ability of Christian communities to conduct their most characteristic activities: worship, education, community life, and sometimes evangelization. What appears far less commonly in the studies are cinematic and historically dramatic responses, like initiating armed rebellion against repressive Caesars, prophetic denunciation, mass protest, and high-profile martyrdoms and imprisonments. While these responses do take place, can be heroic, and are sometimes successful, they are relatively rare. While Shahbaz Bhatti's martyrdom, one that he anticipated, stands as an exemplary case of witness to justice, his life prior to his martyrdom, characterized by strategizing, building coalitions, and lobbying for legislation, and for that matter, his brother Paul's response to his martyrdom, are much more typical of the responses that Christians employ around the world. That Christian responses are creatively pragmatic, neither sexy nor scary, does not mean that they are soulless, narrowly self-interested, or merely tactical, for they often involve, as well, courage, creativity, nimbleness, and theological depth. Though the responses may be short-term and shifting, Christian communities often deploy them out of a long-term theologically grounded hope, not simply for reward or fulfillment beyond this life, but also for a future temporal moment when the persecuting Caesar will fall or the militant group will fade away and the church can then expand in freedom. Thank you.
Well, we have time, good time for questions.
I have a question. My name is Ashlyn Webb. I'm a student at UT Austin. I was wondering if you saw any differences among other demographic setups of how people respond. So if you saw young people behaving more confrontationally, or if you saw things of that sort. If you saw certain groups that behaved a particular way that maybe stood outside of the norms.
Oh, that's a really good question. Off the top of my head, no, we didn't look at that, as a factor, and so I don't have an immediate answer. I think usually I would say it seems to be the kind of responses that we see are led by people who are kind of leaders in the church communities, which tend to be people who are, adults and less the youth and so forth. But it's a very interesting question. It'd be worth looking at more. Yeah. Yes.
Where persecution arises when it wasn't there before, isn't that usually the result of cultural change? The culture is changing different from what it was before, almost like in America right now, where on a TV show like last night, there is open persecution, verbal persecution of Christians that would not have happened here 20 years ago.
Yeah. No, I think, cultural change is a big factor in different ways in different places around the world. But I think that certainly in the West, as we see a kind of rise of secularization, like the rise of, say, the nun category of religious demographic, and a kind of growing sector of that, then I think that does directly bring about a kind of certainly a kind of a diminished respect for religious freedom, diminished sense of the need for religious freedom, but also then when other values compete with religion, then those things are going to be then, used to over and against religious people. And I think that one of the things that I think is important about religious freedom is that it might sound obvious, but predominantly supported among the religious. As you become less religious, you become less convinced that something called religious freedom needs protection. Some might start asking, well, why do we have a clause in our First Amendment for religion? Why does that get a clause? Why does that get protection? Why not just say freedom of thought or conscience or something more general? Religious people can be one of the people maybe under that umbrella, but why something special? Well, I think if people are less religious, they're less likely to see something particular about it. And that's why I think in the last 15 or 20 years, we start to see more and more scholars asking this question, what's so special about religion? Lauren Sager and Chris Eisgruber, Brian Leiter, Micah Schwartzman, many others are starting to say, what's so special about religion? Right.
That's the result of man deciding that there are no absolutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And once you decide that, religion has no place.
Yeah. I think it's also important to, around the world, what we see is one of the kinds of persecuting regimes are regimes with an ideology of secularism. And now writing a book on religious freedom in Islam. And one of the categories of regimes that denies religious freedom are regimes that really have a kind of westernizing aspiration, but is a secular aspiration. And so it's not just a kind of, a kind of nice, soft agnosticism, not really sure what I believe. No, it's a real agenda that goes with a kind of desire to form and install a secular government, which requires, marginalizing religion. Yeah, Peter.
I guess I'm wondering, so you talked about polite persecution. Of the three strategies, well, I guess confrontation probably isn't an option. But of the other two strategies, are there things that people can learn from those strategies for dealing with polite persecution and places where persecution isn't so overt?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, I see what you're saying.
So in other words, are there lessons for their strategies for dealing with persecution?
Yeah.
Christians.
By the way, one of our chapters is by Paul Marshall, who writes on the West and really looks at the kind of strategies used in the West and comparative perspective with others. I think maybe what we see is that there are certain kinds of strategies that are much more likely to be seen in semi-open environments. So you have, some regimes are just across the board repressive, but you also find regimes like say in India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, where you have a fair bit of openness, public contestation, elections, somewhat significantly free press, not totally free, right? But where criticism and open debate is possible. And there, things like demonstrations, court strategies, lobbying of the government, making oneself heard, raising one's voice in different ways, organizing, those kinds of strategies are more likely, as well as kind of robust associational strategies. So you're free to find allies and build coalitions and glom onto a much more powerful coalition that has much more demographic power. If you can associate yourself with that, then your cause will then advance much further, right? And that's where I think there's a kind of continuity between the kind of strategies used in the West, which are mostly, engaging democratic institutions, and including the courts, as well as cultural change strategies. But one can do those things in the open, right? Maybe not in some of these countries in the world. I call them semi-open because you also see persecution. So take a country like India; it's a democracy and there's open conversation, but also there are things like anti-conversion laws, there are Hindu riots, and so there is real violence and real persecution, but that's mixed with an environment where there's also openness, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag, and so there it's these kinds of associational and then confrontational strategies of the kind that involve contestation, democratic contestation, are more common. Whereas in highly repressive environments like, say, China or North Korea or Saudi Arabia, it's going to be mostly strategies of survival, or if confrontation, it's going to involve more using or suffering violence. Yes.
You touched on something she said from a layperson standpoint, and from some of the needs that we see in local communities. I'm wondering if part of that strategy is with those that you have influence to work with in the Waco area.
Yeah.
Those that are Hispanic, Christians, especially, that I'm dealing with the youth situation.
Yeah.
And the gang situations of environments, not gang, but also oppression of economics and so forth, they're dealing with, but are, quote, active up to about X age within the churches.
Yeah.
Within the Afro-American community, we see that, and some of the things that they are faced with. Has there been a strategy, or anybody thinking of practical terms, not only, quote, in the Waco area, and I don't mean that, but I mean among those youth groups, on how to handle and to be observant of how they handle things that are coming from the communities of
Mm-hmm.
Christians, but soon, and are now even at 11, 12, and 13 years old facing.
Mhm,
Has any
mhm.
strategy been thought to address that on a regional basis to develop into a national strategy?
It is the idea like whether some of the lessons from that could carry over to persecution of Christians. Yeah. Well, I think among the youth in particular, you're asking.
Yes, that's what I'm concentrating on.
Yeah.
Can I help with that?
Mm-hmm.
In Iran, it's really fascinating that the strategy of survival, which is protecting the youth and focusing on Christian education, has led to the strategy of partnerships, because these younger people are more conversant with Iranian political. They feel themselves more Iranian, so they're really uniquely able to build bridges that previous generations weren't. So that's an example.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Anybody else want to jump in on that? It's a good question. I don't have an immediate answer. I mean, it's something that would be very interesting to think about, like your question about the youth. I would think Christian education would make a big difference, but also maybe ways in which youth could be drawn into some of the associational strategies of organizing, building partnerships and so forth. But I don't have a ready answer. It's a great question. Yeah.
So I'm really intrigued by this, Dan. Thank you. A lot of the countries y'all are studying, there's religious persecution of several religions in each of these countries, right? Several groups being persecuted. So I'm curious, is there some association or survival strategy that involves interreligious work? I mean, so Christians and Baha'is working together to work, whatever it is, several different religious groups working together to push a kind of broad religious freedom.
Yes, there are. I mean, one of the most dramatic examples of that comes from sub-Saharan Africa that Bob Dowd, our researcher there, he's a political scientist who studies this religion in this region, uncovered. And he discovered, for instance, in Nigeria, there's a lot of bridge building between Christian communities and Muslim leaders in response to the Boko Haram violence. And so if Christians and Muslim in the northern of Nigeria, now their Christians are a real minority, but if they can kind of get the support and build bridges with Muslim leaders, those leaders can best advise them and help them on how to avoid and respond to that violence, but also helps to isolate Boko Haram all the more, from the Muslim community. So there's lots of kind of interreligious work there. That's also true in Kenya. Indonesia is another example where Christians are a tiny minority, but they managed to, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country, but there are two kind of umbrella Muslim popular movements, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, and by and large have a fairly pluralist vision for society. And Christians can have associated with them and aligned with them as a way of gaining support for their protection. But they still continue to face very serious problems there. Yeah.
There was an article in today's Wall Street Journal about Indonesia
Ah.
and how the president has brought in a number 2 man that is a very violent Muslim from his practice, and they're worried about it.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that. It was only in 2016 there were these massive protests coursing through the streets of Jakarta against the Chinese Christian governor of a state. And that was a good example of the kind of things that Christians are facing
He's got
there.
a cleric that they're bringing in.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to put on your prophetic hat for a second, particularly with regard to Turkey with Erdogan.
Yeah,
On the one
yes.
hand, and China with Xi and his kind of cult of personality that's spinning up around him.
Yeah.
Where do you see the churches over there headed to, the Christians over there, and how can you guess how they're going to handle it? Because it sounds like it's getting ready to turn dark on them.
Yeah.
Or already is.
I mean, the story of Christianity in Turkey under the Republic of Turkey is one of, steady decline and one of being, very, very beleaguered of a very tiny community, very often subject to violence and surveillance and discrimination, and has gotten smaller and smaller over the years. One even wonders about it kind of coming to extinction. When Erdogan first took office in 2002, and for maybe the first 9 years or so of his rule, up to 2011, there were a lot of hopes that he would bring in a much more religiously free environment. He was certainly trying to do that on behalf of Muslims, because Turkey's history had been a kind of harshly secularist republic. Ataturk, yeah. He was trying to open up space for more religious freedom for Muslims. He's had limited success, some success in doing that, things like headscarves, and women can now wear headscarves virtually anywhere. That wasn't true before. But in other areas, though, he's had a little bit of trouble doing that. But as far as Christians go, I don't think he's improved the situation much at all. Many have followed the case of Pastor Andrew Brunson, who's been in jail, an American pastor, been a kind of a high-profile case where they're trying to get him released, still in jail. And by the way, the Turkish Christian community plays a major role in our film. So the 26-minute film that we have on our website, one of the major case studies is the Turkish community. So it's profiled in a way there that I think is very, very colorful, with a lot of interviews and so forth. In China, the story in the last 3 or 4 years has been one of increasing crackdown. We've seen, Xi has been very much promoting that, and so we've seen, the destruction of churches and crosses, the breaking up of Christian communities, laws that say that youths under 18 can't worship in a Christian church. In this past Easter, the government authorities were actually going in and removing minors from churches. Now there is uneven enforcement from province to province and so forth and so on, but still I think the broad trend has been one of increasing crackdown. And so, it's yet to see where that was going. Before, around the time of 2014, one of our underseas resort scholars, Fengang Yang at Purdue, was predicting a kind of demographic explosion of Christians in China. And maybe partly in response to that is what has gotten the government to try to clamp down on its growth. But it's certainly been going in the wrong direction in the last few years.
Wasn't one of the conclusions of Young's article that because the government's crackdown on the tearing down the crosses had failed to really produce what it is it wanted, that there might be some greater strength for Christianity in China to come?
Yes. Well, yeah, and that's possible. And one of the things he documented was that during the worst years of the Cultural Revolution, from '66 to 1979, Christianity actually tripled in its numbers, from 1 million to 3 million, and that was under very heavy persecution. So even under persecution, it's possible for the Christian church to grow, but it faces a lot more breaks.
Ken Camp, the Baptist Standard. Given the concern you mentioned early on, the broad concern for religious freedom across the board as a basic human right, and then the specific concern Christians have for those within the household of faith, any recommendations that your project came forward with as far as the 80% of us who live in situations where it's not overt persecution?
Well, in the final section of our public report, we have over 80 recommendations for action. And so they are directed to persecuted communities, non-indigenous or multinational NGOs, NGOs from outside the persecuted part of the world, external governments and multilateral institutions, outside churches and Christian communities, media, journalists, academics, and business, So we have multiple sectors and recommendations of what can be done for each sector. So that's on the report, which is online. Just a few things I might highlight just quickly in terms of like people like us. What could we do? One is I think the critical importance of first just raising awareness and speaking out. And one of the reasons why we wanted to develop curricula and the film and so forth is just to try to get the word out. It's striking to me how few Americans in the U.S. church really know about the plight of persecuted Christians overseas. And there's been some increase in awareness, and but like in the pews and in the Sunday schools and in the kind of household knowledge, it still seems to me that that's fairly low. And so just raising awareness of the plight and speaking out, that often then that people become concerned, that can lead to action. There's many people don't realize, but there is a whole foreign policy apparatus of religious freedom in the U.S. growing out of the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act. Many other Western countries are developing foreign policies of religious freedom. And in ours, we have an office in the State Department that does an annual report. We have an independent U.S. commission. We have a full-time ambassador for religious freedom. And so, if one wanted to, lobby the government or speak out with the government, there's a whole set of kind of apparatus there ready to be mobilized and ready to kind of give attention to this. And there's been some exciting developments in recent months. In July, there was the State Department hosted a ministerial conference on religious freedom for government officials and religious leaders from all over the world who came and gathered in Washington, D.C. To talk about religious freedom and promoting religious freedom. And there are going to be more of these conferences and regional conferences like this that are happening at very high levels with the imprimatur of governments. And so this is an important thing. And citizens can, keep the pressure up and keep the voice up for governments to continue to promote this kind of thing. I also think that there's a lot that we can be doing in the church. One kind of thing is it matters an enormous amount this is like the associational strategy idea, to churches that are in persecuted regions and locales to know that somebody else outside is looking after them. And so, for instance, one idea is like church-to-church partnerships, like a local parish or church congregation or community could form a partnership with a church in Nigeria or Kazakhstan or something like that. Encouragement, material support, maybe visits, lobbying government officials on their behalf, trying to help them in multiple ways. But those kinds of people-to-people partnerships can often do a lot, both materially and psychologically and spiritually, to help. And of course, prayer is very, very important, just to incorporate that into, even in organized ways, to incorporate that into the prayer of churches, or to have kind of networks of Christians, organizing and praying regularly for specific churches around the world that are facing persecution. But again, there's lots more that can be explored.
Other question?
If my church wanted to connect with some church, do you have a list?
One way to do that is, there are organizations out there that are very, devote themselves full time to the persecuted church. There's Aid to the Church in Need. There's Open Doors. There's Voice of the Martyrs. There's the Catholic Near Eastern Welfare Association. I would say my favorite two are probably, there's also the Samaritan's Purse. There's a lot of good ones. My favorite two are Aid to the Church in Need and then Open Doors. And both of them could, you can connect with them, and I think, they, perhaps would be in a position to help make that happen.
Okay. Well, would you join me all thanking our speakers?
Thank you.